Today we're talking about a topic that makes a lot of people uncomfortable because it challenges what we think relationships should look like. Why so many women end up chasing men who act like they don't care. And before you jump to conclusions, this isn't about playing games or being cold. It's about what I've seen repeatedly in my work as a therapist. Patterns that show up quietly, session after session, whether someone realizes they're repeating them or not. Welcome back to the channel, and I'm glad you're here because this conversation matters more than most men realize. Now, when we talk about women chasing men who seem indifferent, we're really talking about something deeper: human psychology under pressure. I've watched people describe the same emotional cycle in different words. A man pulls back, and suddenly the woman who was unsure becomes very aware of what she wants. Not because the distance is healthy, but because it activates something internal, something rooted in self-doubt, desire for reassurance, or fear of losing emotional security. And here's the part most people avoid admitting out loud. Sometimes acting like you don't care doesn't make you more attractive. It simply gives the other person space to project what they wish you felt. I've had clients sit across from me, trying to figure out why someone's indifference pulled them in instead of pushing them away. It's rarely logical, it's almost always emotional. I want you to listen closely today because this video isn't about teaching men to be detached or dismissive. It's about helping you understand why this dynamic happens and how to avoid becoming an emotional placeholder for someone who's responding to their own insecurities rather than genuine interest. So let's break this down clearly, calmly, and honestly, through the lens of real human behavior, the kind I've witnessed over and over again behind closed doors without ever compromising anyone's privacy. 1. Why emotional distance triggers pursuit. When I talk about emotional distance triggering pursuit, I'm not speaking from theory. I'm speaking from years of sitting with people who are trying to understand why they're suddenly obsessed with someone who barely shows interest. I've watched this pattern unfold in countless sessions, and the moment someone says, "I don't even know why I'm thinking about him this much," I already know what's underneath it. It's the emotional tension created when a man isn't immediately available, and it often awakens something in a woman that she didn't expect, a stronger pull toward him. Emotional distance doesn't mean disrespect or coldness. It simply means a man who isn't overly eager, who isn't trying to force a connection, who isn't anxiously proving his worth. And for a lot of women, that lack of pressure feels strangely intriguing. I've had clients describe this very thing without realizing it. They'll say they feel curious or drawn in or confused by him. But when you strip away the language, what they are responding to is the psychological space he leaves. That space gives her room to think, wonder, imagine, and interpret. And that's where pursuit begins. People often chase what feels unresolved, and a man who isn't immediately readable becomes a kind of emotional puzzle, not because she truly wants to chase a man, but because her mind can't settle. She starts filling in the gaps with her own assumptions. Maybe he's busy, maybe he's mysterious, maybe he's selective, maybe he's just confident. Her mind crafts narratives that might have nothing to do with reality, but once those narratives form, they become powerful. I've seen women admit that they didn't even like the man that much in the beginning. What changed wasn't him. It was the emotional shift that occurred when he didn't immediately attach to her. That shift forces a moment of internal reflection, sometimes even insecurity. And insecurity, even subtle insecurity, has a way of creating pursuit. Suddenly, she wants clarity, she wants confirmation, she wants to know where she stands. Without meaning to, she becomes more invested. For men, understanding this isn't about manipulation. It's about recognizing how staying grounded, staying composed, and staying centered in your own world creates a natural pull. When a man's attention isn't scattered everywhere, when he isn't chasing validation, when he isn't desperate for approval, he becomes more compelling. Not because he's pretending not to care, but because his life is already full and he doesn't need someone to fill it for him. That's what emotional distance really is. The space created by a man who values himself enough not to cling. And the truth is, that space often becomes the very thing that draws a woman toward him, not because he's withholding, but because she senses the strength in his independence. 2. The psychology behind "I might lose him." When men hear the phrase fear of loss, they often imagine something dramatic, but in real life, and in countless sessions I've had, it's usually subtle, almost quiet. It's the moment a woman realizes a man isn't orbiting around her. It's when she senses he could walk away, not out of anger or pettiness, but because he genuinely has a life that doesn't pause for her attention. And that subtle awareness triggers something powerful inside her psychology. Let me speak to you as I would to a male client sitting across from me, trying to understand why a woman suddenly became more attentive after he stopped over-investing. What you need to understand is this: people don't fear losing what feels guaranteed. They fear losing what feels valuable. And value is communicated not through words, but through your behavior, your priorities, and your emotional stability. In therapy, I've seen women describe this shift without even realizing what they're admitting. They'll say things like, "He doesn't seem bothered if I take long to reply," or "I can't tell if he likes me that much." On the surface, it sounds like confusion. Underneath, it's something deeper. She's suddenly aware that this man is not dependent on her reactions for emotional balance, and men underestimate how rare that is. This is where things become educational for you as a man. The moment a woman senses that your attention isn't guaranteed, her mind shifts. That shift isn't about playing games, it's about human nature. People invest more deeply in what feels like it has the potential to slip away. It activates curiosity, reflection, and sometimes even a desire to step up emotionally. But here's where many men misunderstand the process. They think the goal is to create fear or distance on purpose. That's not only unhealthy, it's transparent. The real power comes from something much more grounded, living in a way that shows you're not emotionally dependent on whether she chooses you. When your identity doesn't hinge on her approval, she senses it immediately. I've seen this happen in relationships where the woman wasn't even certain she wanted anything serious, but the moment she felt that he wasn't tied to her decisions, she reconsidered. She became more intentional, more communicative, more invested, not because he threatened her or ignored her, but because he showed through calm, consistent behavior that he could take or leave the situation without losing himself. When a man demonstrates inner security, it naturally taps into a woman's instinct to reassess his value. It's not manipulation, it's clarity. She realizes she might lose a man who is emotionally steady, self-respecting, and genuinely autonomous. And losing a man like that suddenly feels like losing an opportunity. So if there's one lesson I want you to take from this section, it's this: a woman doesn't chase because you pull away. She chases because she recognizes you won't collapse if she does. That psychological difference is everything. 3. When her interest is about validation, not connection. One of the most eye-opening patterns I've seen in my therapy work is how often someone mistakes validation for genuine emotional connection. And men, this is where you need to pay attention, because this misunderstanding is the reason many of you feel confused when a woman suddenly becomes interested the moment you stop pouring energy into her. It's not always because she's falling for you. Sometimes it's because your distance triggers a need within her that has very little to do with you personally. Let me explain this the same way I'd explain it to a man sitting across from me, feeling puzzled after a woman who once seemed indifferent suddenly wants his time, attention, and presence. What she's experiencing in that moment may not be attraction. It might be a desire for reassurance. Validation becomes the goal, not connection. In sessions, I've heard people describe this emotional shift without realizing what they're revealing. A woman might say things like, "I just want to know what he's thinking," or "I don't like feeling unsure," or "It bothers me that he doesn't seem affected." The common thread in all these statements isn't love or depth. It's discomfort with uncertainty. When you were giving her consistent attention, she didn't need to question anything. Everything felt secure. Everything felt predictable. But when you stopped overextending yourself, she was left alone with her internal dialogue. And that dialogue can be powerful. For many women, especially those who haven't fully developed emotional self-awareness, the mind automatically shifts into a place of wanting to get back the feeling of being desired, not because they want the man, but because they want to feel wanted. That's where a lot of men get caught off guard. You assume her sudden interest means she's realizing your worth, but what may actually be happening is her ego noticing the absence of attention. And the ego doesn't like silence. It wants confirmation. It wants to restore the sense of control it had before. This is why you see situations where a woman becomes intensely interested when you're distant. But once you give her attention again, the energy fades. It's not that she lost interest in you, it's that she gained back the validation she was subconsciously chasing. Once that need is met, the emotional tension dissolves. Understanding this difference is crucial. If you mistake validation seeking for genuine connection, you'll end up investing in dynamics that were never truly about you. You'll give and she'll take, but neither of you will feel the emotional depth you're hoping for. Here's the part I want you to really internalize. A woman who is interested in you seeks consistency, clarity, and emotional presence. A woman who is seeking validation seeks reaction, reassurance, and proof that she can still affect you. Your job as a man is to recognize the difference, so you don't build your self-worth on someone else's temporary insecurities. 4. How indifference creates misread signals. One of the most revealing things I've seen in my therapy work is how easily people misinterpret emotional distance, especially inside a relationship. And I want to share something with you that reflects this dynamic, without exposing any personal details. I once worked with someone who was deeply confused about her partner's behavior. She cared about him, but she couldn't understand why the quieter he became, the more drawn to him she felt. What she didn't realize at the time was that his calmness, which came from his own emotional exhaustion, was triggering a reaction in her that had almost nothing to do with love and everything to do with uncertainty. This is the kind of situation many of you will recognize. When a man becomes less expressive, less reactive, or simply more focused on his own life, a woman who's unsure of her emotional footing can start reading that shift in ways that don't reflect reality. In that couple's case, the partner interpreted his emotional withdrawal as confidence, mystery, even strength. She kept saying, "I don't know why I want him more, but I do." Meanwhile, he was sitting in his own internal struggle, trying to figure out how to communicate without overwhelming the relationship. That's what I want you to understand. Indifference, or even just quiet, can create a space where assumptions grow. And assumptions often feel more powerful than facts. When a man isn't reacting, a woman might assume he's unbothered. When he's not over-explaining, she might assume he's secure. When he's not chasing after arguments or emotional moments, she might assume he's selective, composed, or deeply grounded. But sometimes he's simply tired. Sometimes he's unsure. Sometimes he's trying to avoid conflict. Sometimes he's giving space because he doesn't know what else to do, yet the silence gets misread as strength and the distance gets mistaken for intention. This is why so many men feel confused when a woman suddenly becomes more emotionally invested at the exact moment he stops trying as hard. The shift in her behavior often has more to do with interpretation than reality. She's responding to what she thinks the distance means, not what it truly is. For men, the lesson here is incredibly important. People project meaning onto your behavior when you stop giving them direct information. If you're calm and composed because you're genuinely centered, that can create a healthy attraction. But if your indifference is coming from unresolved frustration or emotional fatigue, it might still pull her in, just for the wrong reasons. That's why clarity matters. Not performative clarity, but internal clarity. When a woman senses that you're not emotionally dependent on her reactions, it naturally changes her behavior. But when she senses confusion disguised as distance, she'll still respond, just not in a way that leads to healthy connection. Misread signals can make a woman chase a man she doesn't fully understand. And unless a man understands what his silence represents, he can end up in a dynamic he never intended to create. 5. The hidden appeal of unpredictable men. There's a relationship I often think about when I talk to men about unpredictability, not because it was dramatic or chaotic, but because it shows how subtle emotional unpredictability can be, and how strongly someone can react to it without ever admitting it. I once worked with someone who couldn't explain why she felt so drawn to her partner, even though he wasn't the most consistent communicator. He wasn't unreliable in a harmful way, he simply had a life, routines, responsibilities, and moments where he was present and moments where he wasn't. She described it as never quite knowing what version of him I'd get. And instead of pushing her away, that unpredictability pulled her closer. That might surprise some men hearing this. We're taught that consistency is everything. And yes, consistency matters deeply for a healthy relationship. But when we talk about attraction, the psychological spark, unpredictability creates a type of emotional tension that many people don't fully understand. In this particular relationship, the partner's natural rhythm made her feel challenged. She didn't have full control over the emotional pace. Some days he was warm and expressive, other days quiet and introspective. Not because he was manipulating, but because he genuinely moved with his own internal world. And here's the interesting part. She interpreted this as depth. When someone can't easily categorize you, it activates their curiosity. She described him as someone who keeps me on my toes, even though he wasn't doing anything deliberately to create that dynamic. His unpredictability wasn't instability, it was authenticity. It was his emotional reality shifting based on his life, not her expectations. This is where many men misunderstand the attraction women feel toward unpredictability. They think it means they must withhold affection, become cold, or play emotional games. But in healthy dynamics, the appeal comes from something very different. The sense that a man has a world outside of the relationship, that he isn't available 24/7, that his mood, energy, and attention aren't controlled by her reactions. The person I mentioned once admitted, when he's really present, it means something. It feels earned. That statement reveals a lot. Unpredictability amplifies meaning. When every moment of affection is expected, people take it for granted. But when affection comes from a man who gives it freely one day and is quieter the next, simply because life affects him too, it feels more authentic. Men often forget this. Emotional predictability is comforting, but emotional texture is attractive. You don't have to perform unpredictability. You don't have to manufacture distance. But when you live in a way that reflects a genuine full life, where your emotions shift naturally, where your attention isn't constant, where your presence isn't guaranteed, it creates a dynamic that many women find compelling. In that relationship, the partner wasn't chasing chaos. She was responding to a man who didn't bend himself into predictability to keep her comfortable. And in that space, she saw depth, strength, and individuality, qualities that often create the strongest pull. 6. Why genuine self-possession attracts more than effort. One of the most powerful patterns I've noticed in my therapy work is how consistently women respond to men who have a strong sense of self. Not ego, not arrogance, not cold detachment, but genuine self-possession. The ability to stay grounded in who you are without bending yourself for approval or chasing emotional reassurance. And I want you to understand this clearly, because it's the difference between a man who constantly tries to impress and a man who naturally attracts without forcing anything. Let me explain it the same way I would to a young man sitting across from me who feels like he has to perform to keep someone interested. What women respond to isn't performance, it's presence. Presence means you show up fully as yourself, without shrinking or inflating your personality depending on who's in front of you. I've seen women describe this kind of man in ways that are incredibly telling. They'll say things like, he knows who he is, or he's calm even when things feel uncertain, or he's not trying to convince me of anything. And when you listen closely, what they're really talking about is emotional stability, a groundedness that doesn't shift with external reactions. You might think effort is what wins people over. But effort without self-possession becomes overexertion. It reads as neediness. It communicates, I'm trying to be enough for you instead of I already am, and you can join my world if you choose. That shift in energy changes everything. I've had sessions with people who didn't understand why they lost interest in someone who was giving them everything they asked for. They weren't ungrateful. They weren't cruel. They simply felt overwhelmed by the pressure of being the center of someone's emotional universe. And when the man finally stepped back, they suddenly saw him differently. Not because he changed, but because the loss of pressure allowed them to appreciate his natural presence. That's what self-possession does. It lets your authentic qualities breathe. When you're centered, you don't chase clarification every time someone becomes distant. You don't panic at silence. You don't force conversations that aren't ready to happen. Instead, you operate from a steady place inside yourself. And that steadiness creates emotional space, the very space that draws a woman in. Consider this. Effort can be impressive, but self-possession is reassuring. It tells her, you don't have to carry my whole emotional world. And that is far more attractive than constant pursuit. The men who attract effortlessly aren't necessarily better looking or more charming. They're simply rooted. They maintain their friendships, passions, routines, and goals, not as a strategy, but as a lifestyle. Their world doesn't shrink just because they like someone. When a man stands firm in who he is, without forcing, performing, or chasing, he becomes the kind of presence people gravitate toward. Women don't feel pressured around him. They feel curious. They feel safe. They feel drawn to the steadiness he carries. And that's the real power of self-possession. It's not loud. It's not flashy. It's not a game. It's quiet confidence. And that's what lasts. 7. Turning this dynamic into healthy boundaries. One thing I've learned in years of working with people is that most men misunderstand what not caring really means. They try to imitate indifference, hoping it will make a woman chase them, but that only creates confusion, resentment, and unhealthy relationship patterns. The real strength, the version that actually pulls a woman toward you, comes from having boundaries. Healthy, steady, grounded boundaries. And I want to break this down for you in a way that feels practical, relatable, and empowering. I've sat across from men who felt exhausted because they had no boundaries at all. They were overgiving, over-explaining, over-committing. They weren't acting from confidence. They were acting from fear. Fear of losing the connection, fear of disappointing her, fear of not being enough. And the saddest part is that they believed this effort would make her stay. But effort without boundaries just turns you into an emotional sponge. It doesn't make you attractive, it makes you drained. Then I'd speak with women who felt conflicted because they didn't actually want all of that effort. They wanted someone who could hold his own, someone who had a life, a voice, a sense of direction, someone who wouldn't melt every time there was tension, someone who could tell them no without fear. That's what boundaries look like, and that's what creates real attraction. Here's the part most men overlook. Healthy boundaries look a lot like indifference from the outside, but the intention behind them is completely different. Indifference says, I don't care what happens. Boundaries say, I care about myself enough to protect my emotional health. That difference is everything. When a woman senses that you have boundaries, she feels something she rarely feels with men who overextend: respect. She respects the fact that you're not trying to earn her approval. She respects that you don't crumble when she pulls back. She respects that your world doesn't revolve around her mood swings or her level of interest that day. Boundaries also create clarity. When you don't tolerate mixed signals, inconsistency, or disrespect, it sends a message far louder than pretending not to care ever could. It says, my life is meaningful with or without you, and if we're going to build something, it has to be healthy for both of us. That level of self-respect naturally makes a woman step up her behavior if she truly values you, and it gently filters out those who are only seeking attention. The most attractive men I've worked with were never the ones chasing or performing. They were the ones who stood tall in their standards. They didn't punish anyone for pulling away. They didn't play mind games. They simply lived with intention. If someone wanted to be in their life, great. If not, they didn't collapse. Boundaries aren't about making anyone chase you. They're about making sure you never have to chase yourself. And when a man lives that way, the right woman doesn't run from him. She gravitates toward him, naturally, consistently, and with genuine interest. What you've learned through this video isn't about pretending not to care. It's about understanding the deeper psychology that makes certain men stand out. When you stay grounded, protect your energy, and hold meaningful boundaries, you create the emotional space that draws a woman toward you naturally. Not through pressure, performance, or games, but through a quiet confidence that speaks for itself. The patterns I've seen over the years all point to the same truth. Women respond to men who value themselves. When you stop chasing and start living with intention, the right connection doesn't slip away, it reveals itself.